So good morning. This is the Police Responses to Violence panel, and my name is Ejeris, Dixon, and I'm from Vision Change Wind Consulting, and I guess I've been in organizing and supporting and consulting around issues of state violence, transformative justice, and economic justice, and racial justice for about 20 years now. So I'm really excited to be here and to introduce these geniuses, all to my right. Before we get into the panel, I just wanted to kind of frame and think about why it's so important for us to hold space to talk about the criminalization of survival and police responses to violence. So honestly, the panel last night was fire, and there was particularly Mariame's contribution was incredible, so there's not really too much more to say on the concept. So I'm actually going to talk a little bit from my own personal experience. So 12 years ago this month, I did my very first intake on violence. I had a history of doing economic justice work, and what I mean by an intake is kind of when you sit down and talk with a survivor about their experience, what they need, and how you can support. And this incredibly striking, honestly, beautiful black gay man, more femme presenting, had shown up at my office, which was in the basement at the Audre Lorde project. And he had written an email and then said, "Can we come in and talk about what happened?" So at that time, we're talking about the mid-2000s in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, and there was a club called The Lab that hosted a whole bunch of parties. I'm talking like Fulton and Brooklyn Avenue, for folks who know Brooklyn like that. And and on Sunday nights, there would be a party that was mostly a gay men's party. And so he had gone to the party, had a great time. There's a Popeyes around the corner, and he'd gone to the Popeyes. After he left the Popeyes, he was really brutally attacked by two black cis men. And the way that he was able to kind of get that attack to stop was by picking up a trash can and throwing trash and shaking it at people. So at that point, he also spots some NYPD and thinks maybe he can get the support that he needs for medical attention and all of these things. Needless to say, when he started to engage with the cops and recognize he'd just survived this attack and was incredibly agitated, in pain, and upset, he ends up in handcuffs, he ends up arrested, he ends up at the 79th precinct, and he ends up beaten again. And so he's in front of me telling me this story, and I'm listening. And at that point, I had started to do work around safety and around how do we create alternative forms of safety. And I said, "What do you need?" And he said, "I need a lawyer, then we're gonna get my fucking charges dropped, then we're gonna make sure this shit don't happen to nobody else." And that was my entry into this work. So I think, as many folks said last night, talking about police violence in a way that centers the experiences of black women, women of color, trans women of color, and gender nonconforming people of color means that we actually also have to talk about the different ways and sites and locations that police violence happens, including the fact that when people have experienced intimate partner violence, sexual violence, or hate violence, and may need support, often they're also experiencing either a lack of response, violence in the police response, arrest, or worse. And I think the character of this particular, just this form of multiple violations happening at the same time can create deep trauma, extreme mistrust, and then in addition, our movements, or the police violence movement, doesn't necessarily center that response to, like that violence and the response to other forms of violence is actually something that should be held within the movement. So it's kind of relegated to another space. And I think, as people in the previous panels said, our society has entrusted some of the most violent people to be our first responders. And so many of us know within our bodies, our lives, and through the generations that we've been taught that we need to create safety for ourselves and safety outside of those constructs. So those issues have led to so many of the amazing folks on this panel to work on community-based safety strategies, whether we call them community accountability or transformative justice. And we're so excited to kind of dig into this topic with you, to really raise up the work. We know that many folks in this room are also engaged in that, and we want to be within a critical dialogue with you all. So to introduce our amazing folks, one person you'll recognize from last night, Mariame Kaba. So Mariame Kaba is an organizer, educator, and curator whose work focuses on racial justice, gender justice, transformative and restorative justice, ending violence, dismantling the prison industrial complex, and supporting youth leadership development. She is the founder and director of Project NIA, a grassroots organization with a vision to end youth incarceration. Our second panelist is Cara Page. Cara Page is a Black, feminist, queer, cultural memory worker and organizer. She comes from a long ancestral legacy of organizers and cultural workers from the Southeast to the Northeast. And for the past 20 plus years, she is okay, I can read. She's fought for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, and gender nonconforming people of color liberation, and organized in racial, reproductive, and economic justice movements. Renata Hill. Renata Hill is currently a full-time student on the path to earn an associate's degree in human services at the Borough of Manhattan Community College, and will then work to get her master's degree in social work. She has toured the country speaking out for the case of the New Jersey 7 and for all women who are incarcerated for defending themselves. Renata is currently serving as an AmeriCorps member at St. Paul's Community and Development Corporation in Paterson, New Jersey. Her position as an AmeriCorps member is a case manager aide for formerly incarcerated individuals. And finally, Jemisha Williams. Jemisha is a Black queer femme born in the Bronx and currently living in Brooklyn. She is a former apprentice at the Center for Neighborhood Leadership and extremely passionate about both food justice and abolition. Jemisha is the current organizing fellow for the Safe Outside the System Collective, where she is constantly imagining and working towards a new world devoid of cops, prisons, and other institutions that prioritize punishment over healing. So Mariame, recognizing your incredibly long history and the depth of the work that you've done around criminalized survivors, I was wondering if you can just talk to us a bit about what are the issues with police response to violence, what does it look like, and some strategies to address.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for being here early. If I wasn't on this panel, I wouldn't be here until the afternoon or maybe the evening, 5 p.m. or so, so yay for you all. I also don't do photos, so please don't take pictures or videos or stuff like that. I appreciate it. I'm sure the rest of them love photos, so take photos of them. So I've been doing work around supporting criminalized survivors of violence for a long time. When I started doing work, I started working in domestic violence by working at an organization here in New York City called Sanctuary for Families. Some of you may know that organization. I worked there starting in 1994. That dates me. Some of you weren't alive at that point. I know that. Don't bring it up. People bring it up all the time. They're like, 94? I was born in 98, whatever. Whatever. Okay, so anyway, so I started working there, and pretty early on I figured out that I had very little to actually offer survivors who came to us when there was violence that they were dealing with, because mainly the survivors that I was working with were not looking to call the police. They were not looking for orders of protection. They basically wanted the violence to end, and most of them wanted to stay with the partner that they were with. So everything that I was being taught in 40-hour trainings, everything that was being discussed in media, like, this is pre-Lifetime Channel movies where, that's kind of how you learned about domestic violence. That was not in the ethos and the ether of the conversations that were happening. So I found myself kind of trying to figure out strategies for people to stay safer than they were. So a lot of harm reduction work, a lot of trying to piece together other resources that could support that person, maybe until they figured out whether or not they actually wanted to leave, rather than being pressured to leave in the moment. That might be very dangerous for them. So anyway, for years and years and years, I ended up having cases sometimes where people would actually try to defend themselves from their abuser and end up in the system themselves. So they, quote unquote, under mutual arrests, where the cops would come in and say, I just don't know who the person is who's the abuser, so both of you are going to jail tonight, right? All those kinds of moments where people were actually in self-defense, trying to ward off the abuser, and when people came to the house, they took them because they were the one that was injured, or they were the one who wasn't injured, right? And depending on what kind of relationship it was, if it was a same-sex relationship, it's much more likely than both of them would end up getting arrested, because nobody could be bothered, right? What I also learned were that cops hated domestic violence cases. They hate them. They actually didn't want to respond, which is why there was a lack of response for all those years, where people would walk around the corner, do everything. And I would have to go and do these horrible roll call trainings of cops. Everybody who's been in DV knows this. You go there, and you have these rows of police officers coming in half an hour at a time, supposedly to get trained on domestic violence. The cops hate those roll calls. People who are doing the training hate the roll calls. They're useless, right? But we still do them because we're getting paid by the state to do them, and because the cops are being mandated to attend. So the idea that I think Monifa pointed out in the prior panel about cops becoming social workers or being charged with social work-like work is not new. It's something we've been demanding of police for a long time, and it's something police actually have been resisting for a long time, and yet the public keeps saying, this is what you need to be doing. The job description for being a cop has expanded to everything. When in fact, most of the cops who come into doing the job really wanted to solve murder. That's what they came to do, really. That's honestly the truth of the situation. So at some level, we have to tell the truth about what the public is asking the police to do in order to maintain its legitimacy within the democratic system, and what the cops actually want to do. And then, there's a huge gulf of a disconnect there. And I think that actually, if we let the cops not do all the work they don't want to do, imagine how much freer we'd all be. And imagine what could happen instead. And if they didn't have to respond to the mental health calls, because they hate doing that, right? And we actually had the people who were trained to do wellness checks who didn't have guns. Imagine how much fewer people would be killed on a daily basis. So there's something here about, we talk about police response as though the police themselves aren't telling the public on a regular basis they don't want to do this work. And the public somehow, and I'm putting all of you in that category, is you got to do the work. So if somebody's telling you they don't want to do it, they don't want to be trained in doing it, why are you still expecting that this is what they ought to be doing? Why? And so that's at the stage at which I realized this was not going to be a punishment issue. We weren't going to be able to address domestic violence through punishment, period. And it was also the moment when I began to understand the concepts around carceral feminism, where, you know, everything gets solved by more arrest, prosecution, and incarceration. That's how we're going to end gender violence. And that's proven to actually be a complete and utter failure. Because that is not how we're going to end it. It isn't even how we're going to begin to end it, right? It's actually perpetuating more forms of violence for particular populations that feminists, some of them, don't care about, that are seen as people who are expendable. And so therefore, like, if all these black women get criminalized because we've got a system now that we insist has to be focused on arrest, prosecution, and incarceration, their collateral damage is all good, as long as middle-class white women are okay, right? Like, there are people wanting to sacrifice other people in the service of their safety. And I think we've got to, like, interrogate that, and we've got to, like, fight against that. And so that's been a large part of the work I've been doing over the years, has been to raise those contradictions, talk about how we're going to create support networks in community to actually support survivors of violence, and basically create freedom campaigns to free people who have been caught up in the system as a result of defending their lives and or surviving. So that's part of the work and what I've been trying to do.
Thank you, Mariame. So Cara Page, among a host of issues you've worked on, there's a portion of your work that's at the intersection of transformative justice and the medical industrial complex, centered on addressing police responses. And I would love for you to give us some more context, to talk about what violence looks like in that context and what we can do about it.
Great. Thank you. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thanks for your brilliance, Mariame, as always. And I just want to give a lift up to Andrea Ritchie and BCRW for hosting this space for us, and all the comrades who've spoken or are going to speak. It's an honor to be here with all of you. So let's see. I realize I'm heading towards 50 rapidly, so actually for the last over 30 years, I've been committed to working against the sterilization abuse of black women, of women of color, of indigenous folks, of people with disabilities. Really though, it took me into my mid-20s for me to understand that I was really against the policing and surveillance of the public health system, really being used as an extension of the state to model ideas of health or concepts of safety and wellness inside of public and private medical institutions that were under the guise of protecting our emotional, physical well-being, and actually being rooted in the foundational concepts of population control, scientific racism, and eugenic ideas that preempt that we shouldn't exist and that our genetic makeup actually is less than human and we are therefore expendable. So those are a lot of big words, so let me just slow it down for a minute. Historically, the role of medicine and healing has been traditional to the survival and integral to the political liberation of black folks, indigenous folks, and folks of color in the globe, right? Let's just sit with that. Yet we have been dispossessed from our own ideas of healing, our own ideas of wellness, and our own intuition of understanding what well-being spiritually, physically, emotionally, and psychically can look like. And as we've watched the decimation of, I'm not even talking about public health care, we've watched the decimation and the decentralizing of healers and health workers that are our people, our ancestors, who have carried forth the idea of safety and wellness since slavery, on how we take care of our own, has been decimated by a public health system that was rooted in how do we surveil, how do we track, and how do we make sure those of us who are survival and fit should exist, and those of us who should not. Our medicines have been stolen from us, sold back to us by big pharma, and we've been criminalized then for using them, right? Let's start at best with birth workers, who are now being criminalized for their indigenous Black traditions of birthing and healing that has actually then been stolen by the medical industrial complex and sold back to us. We're really at a stage in the 21st century of the illegitimacy of healing from our own people. And what is the loss of that? We have no idea yet what the impact will continue to be. But what I want to say is this: the medical industrial complex, when we're talking about anti-policing and abolition, needs to be at the center of that conversation. And I no longer can be complicit with anti-violence conversations that aren't looking at the role of scientific racism in the medicine used to pathologize and make our communities expendable. In particular, the contemporary role of nurses, doctors, and health practitioners to be in partnership with police, with ICE, with federal law enforcement for the absolute physical removal of people when they're just going in for fucking services from pap smear to death, right? So what does this mean for us to continue to be complicit to a space that is both an extension of policing, but then also isn't survivor-led? What does it mean to reconsider medicinal, traditional practices of healing and wellness that don't come out of this idea of to be saved, to be healed, but actually to be reclaiming our traditions, and how do we build safety and wellness in our own communities? I would be remiss not to speak to the role of a natural disaster-based economy that very much shapes how we think about public health now, right? I mean, even if you think about Katrina and the role of the Louisiana governor calling for sterilization abuse because he was blaming Black, Vietnamese, and indigenous people for why Katrina happened. We were too many people on the Gulf Coast, so therefore, let's make sure we sterilize the next generation so when the next storm comes, we won't get hit. What? This is a problem, people. But this is common, and this shapes ideology and population control policy and law enforcement all over the globe. And to understand that population control is the medical idea that the root cause of environmental degradation is based on women of color's fertility. That is the onset of much of the laws and policies that we are counteracting. So just to bring it back to safety and transformative justice, how will we intervene on the use of deportations at hospitals, asking nurses and doctors to report to ICE when people come in and don't have legitimate ID? How are we challenging the role of Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, the use of HIPAA by hospitals permitting the release of protected health information without a patient's consent, and the multiple stories we're hearing, especially of poor Black and immigrant and indigenous folk who go into a hospital and don't even know that the ICE or the police have been called. And there are several cases of people suing hospitals for this, but it's seen as isolated instances instead of a systemic issue or organizing. It's part of our political liberation, y'all. We have to understand the role of how public health is an extension of police. And finally, I will say the use of body cams on doctors and nurses is coming, right? Now, all of us have had very long political conversations, right? Especially here in New York City around the use of body cams and who that's really for. A tool of the state to obviously take away our privacy and increase surveillance. Can you imagine if you walk into a clinic or to a hospital and the camera is on as you're coming in bleeding or whatever else you got going on, and how that raises the level of lack of, I would say, dignity, grace, and integrity between you and that interaction with a nurse and a doctor. But what I'll say is this: there are people actually thinking about this. And for the first time, I am witnessing 3 parts, and then I'll finish, the role of public health and in eugenic and surveillance policing practices. Here in New York City and actually in San Francisco, several of us have been part of advising staff about where does public health actually build onto policing, surveillance, and racism and colonization, and how will you be accountable for the history, including Columbia, that house eugenic conferences? How will these larger institutions actually be called on to change their practices and teach something different in their institutions? Do I got some pre-med students in here, public health law, social workers? Right, what are you being told about the role of institutional public health being used for policing and surveillance? You're not. So how are we gonna use, what's the opportunity here to break the narrative? And then finally, there are community-led strategies, which I'll get into later in conversation, being led by healers of physical, body, energy-based work, and health practitioners, and scientists. I'm not anti-science. I'm for responsibility and liberatory practices. Ooh.
So Renata, we're honored to have you here.
Thank you.
And to really speak about, I don't know of a clearer example of when people experience violence and then fight back to protect themselves and then experience criminalization. And I would love for you to speak about your experience, about your reflections and your political work. And you're probably speaking to a lot of folks in the room who were part of the organizing around the case of the Jersey Seven, so.
Thank you. Well, for me, I mean, I was sitting here looking at this question since yesterday. I'm a last minute type of person. I'm like, let me prepare last night, literally. And I was reading, I'm like, what do police responses to violence look like now? And I'm looking and I'm like, it looks like me. You know, it looks like my situation. It actually looks like violence on top of the violence they're responding to. And back in 2006, we came from, Newark, New Jersey to come out to the city, a safe space for us, which we thought was the village. We lived in Newark, and there was a lot of gang activity going on at the time, and we didn't want no parts of that, So it was like, let's go to the pier. We had hit up the liquor store, typical young folks, like, let's go to the pier, get wasted, flirt. And as we got off the train and we got near where IFC movie theater is, it was a guy, and we're not paying attention to anybody around us. Like, we're literally like, it was 7 of us in total, laughing, joking, tripping each other, just being, regular comedians as we always are. And then someone asked, he was like, yo, let me get some of that. And he pointed to Patrice Johnson, and her birthday had just passed. She had just turned 18. So we had been acting up all weekend, like turning up, right? And Patrice literally was 91 pounds. I'll give her that extra pound. She was 91, not 90. I'm not going to round it off, right? And 4'11". She looks like somebody's daughter. She is somebody's daughter, right? But she didn't even look like she was of legal age yet. And I'm just like, what? Patrice, being who she is, she's like, she had a soda bottle in her hand. She thought he was saying, let me get some of that, meaning a soda, but he literally was pointing to her private area. So I'm just like, I wasn't in the mood. I'm like, man, these is all my girlfriends, the masculine identified women, all of them, they all my girlfriends, we start laughing. And he's like, ain't nobody talking to you, you dyke bitch, and this, that, and the third. It just got really, really intense, really, really fast. And I'm just like, whoa, I was not expecting that at all. I was expecting for him to just respect what I was saying was going on and sit back on the hydrant and we continue out our business. And as we were still walking as we was talking, so we wasn't looking for trouble, and he got up and he proceeded to follow us. And he was just saying some really vulgar things out his mouth, which, it got my attention. Because, one of the things he said was, I'll fuck you straight. Now, I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. So you telling me you gonna F me straight, meaning basically you about to, rape me, because obviously I just told you I'm a lesbian. I'm not giving it up to you, So that got my attention, and I turned around, and still in all, I'm not even really ready to fight. I just want to drink at this point, right? So I'm just like, let me just joke on him. I'm like, bro, look at your sneakers. Like, you could never bag a girl from me. I got real cocky, I was like, I know how to get them. And I didn't know it was going to really affect him in a way that he felt like he had to prove a point, but he felt like he needed to prove a point, a really violent point. And what happened was I didn't realize that it was a crowd forming around us. And I guess I bruised his ego or killed his ego, because it got to a point where he hog spit. And I mean from all the way down here, hog spit, and spit in my face, and then flicked a cigarette. And it just went crazy from there. One question that people always ask me, when I was going through the court system is, and even my lawyer, do you remember if you hit him first or he hit you first? And I struggled with that for a long time. Like, damn, I used to ask Patrice and all of them, did I hit him first when he spit? And then after a while, I realized, do it matter? He assaulted me with bodily fluids. Do it matter? He was literally this close to me to get spit on from that, whether it's this close or that, that far away. I stopped questioning my actions. I questioned it for a long time. The whole time we did served our time, I questioned. And Patrice, even to this day, she always questioned, because he ended up getting stabbed in the process. But we had other people that jumped in, that felt the need to jump in our defense, not in his. So obviously they felt that we were still in danger. Although it's 7 of us, we wasn't all on him at the same time. So while he's attacking me, my friends is trying to make sure I get away safe. Once he let loose of me, he grabbed another person, he started fighting them, and we wasn't walking away unless it was all of us, point blank, period. So however this is going to end, it's going to end. So some other guys jumped in, and this was all caught on surveillance, right? The mystery guy with the pink shirt. I love this guy. I hope one day he hears me and just be like, listen, I'm the one that came. I'll give him a hug. I'm not mad. People be like, well, he should have did the time. Nobody should have did the time. I would, even if I knew who he was, I wouldn't say, no, he's the one that stabbed him. Absolutely not. He saved our life. You know, and our life is important, it's valuable, right? So we end up fighting. He ended up, you know, when we left, he was all right. He was still fighting the guys. We left. We went across the street, literally, from where we was fighting. Went into McDonald's. We was hungry. We was like, we can't drink on an empty stomach. We still thinking about having a good time, right? And we went to McDonald's. We ordered food. We used the bathroom or whatever. And somebody came in and was like, yo, who just had a fight? And I'm like, why? What's up? And they like, it's cops looking for y'all everywhere. They got guns drawn. They coming down one-way streets. And I'm just, in my head, I'm like, why? All we did was fight. It's not that serious, you know? Because where we from, you have a fight, the cops is called, they don't even show up. So we're not expecting, like, why is they rushing around like this looking for us, you know? So we leave out and we literally see the unmarked cars coming down one ways, like speeding. And I'm like, yo, they looking for 7 girls. So y'all 4 go over there. We got to get back to the train station. It's time to go home. I don't know what's going on. At this point, we didn't know the guy was stabbed. So a block before we get to the train station, I seen the cops coming, and before I can verbalize it to my friends, they already had all my friends up against the wall, and I had already fell back. So I'm leaning up against a storefront, and I'm watching everything take place. I'm watching as they throw Patrice onto the car, go into her bag. One of the witnesses was like, that's the stabber, she did it. They empty her bag, it's a knife there, you know, and I'm just sitting there, and the guy turned around, and he was like, she was there too, I think she's one of the ones too, and I'm smoking a cigarette. You know, and he was like, up against the wall, and I'm like, man, I'm smoking my cigarette. And he's like, put the cigarette down. So I'm like, I bought these in New York. They cost a lot. You know, I'm being, you know, and that's just me. Like, I'm a play fiend, you know what I'm saying? I'm like, I don't really take much serious, and still it's not hitting me on how they really ran up on us. Like, shit just got real, you know, because up until that, I really believed in the system doing the right thing, right? When you watch the news, and you read the paper, you only see what they're telling you or what they want you to see. So as a child growing up, I believe that a person that was in jail, they deserved to be there. They did something and they deserved to be in jail until I was placed in that situation. Because back then, it wasn't a lot of people raising awareness or protesting like that. Or if it was, I wasn't aware of it. You know what I'm saying? I was sheltered from that. So, you know, they end up incarcerating us. They had us in a holding cell for about, I'll say, well, close to 24 hours. Allowed us to keep smoking, never gave us water. Anybody that smokes out there know if you keep smoking and you don't drink water, you get cotton mouth. Like, you start foaming at the mouth. They didn't give us any food. You know, they just kept coming in there asking us, tell us what happened, and we'll let you go home. But they had us all in separate cells, so we couldn't talk to each other. Now, again, we're not thinking that we did anything wrong. This guy spit in my face. We had a fight. What's the big deal? Why are we here? Can we call our family members? No, all I'm thinking about is I have a 5-year-old son at home, and every morning, and I used to go out, but I had a living babysitter. Every morning when my son opened his eyes, his mother was in that house. You know, being a mother, regardless of how turned up I was the night before, it was just routine. That is my child, and that's all I kept thinking about. So I'm like, you know what, y'all, let's just write down what happened so we could go home. And that led into, you know, being harassed even more because I wrote the statement, and I guess my statement was too much being in French. You know, we left New York, we got to city, we got harassed, you know, we got attacked, we fought back, we left, we got incarcerated. He's like, no, I need to know specifics on who did what. That's your job. I'm not going to say I'm not putting any of my friends' name in there. And still, I don't know the severity of even writing a statement, because once you write anything, you're admitting that you played a part in something. I never knew that. They didn't even let me have, like, legal representation to inform me that. They did not read us our Miranda rights. But again, in court, when we spoke about that, it was our word against the officers. Oh, we read them their rights. Who proving it? How are you proving it? We didn't sign off on anything, you know. So we got attacked in the street by this guy. We got attacked. We got harassed. 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 We got hara and antagonized in a jail, in a holding cell. And then as we went to court, we had to hear the judge and everybody saying, well, you guys are from Newark. What were you even doing in the city? How could you even afford to be out there? You know, you had to be coming out here looking for problems. Like, nah. I asked my lawyer, I was like, can I tell her I was coming out here looking for shorties? You know, and I'm still like, you know, this is all going to be over. You know, so sad that we got to go through this, but it's going to be over. They're going to see the surveillance, they have everything. We're going to go to court. And it dragged on. We went back and forth to court for close to 11 months until we finally went to trial. We decided to go to trial because, again, I'm still believing in the system. They're going to see it for what it is. And we went to trial. 4 of us went to trial. 3 of them took a deal, 6 months, 5 years probation. And in trial, it was just like more abuse, and the way they talked about us, the way the media dehumanizes in the papers. And it's like, well, why nobody saying that I was a single mother? I took care of my kid by myself. I've never been in trouble with the law. I was the first one in my family to graduate high school. Why are they not talking about that? But if it was Sarah, she comes from a prominent business, business family, this, that, and the third. She went to this type of school. She's glorified. But where it's people of color, and now it's starting to make sense. People are talking to me. Organizers are writing me, letting me know. And I'm just like, okay, this is real. Even coming home now, fast forward to me being released, having a fight to get custody of my son, having to go through a psychosocial, and my crime had nothing to do with children at all, or let alone my child. False allegations that was made against me in order for my son to be snatched away from me in the first place and me not even be notified. My mom dying in prison and me not being able to go to her services because she died in New Jersey and not in New York. Coming home and not having the resources. These programs that are out here that say, yeah, we want to help and support you, but it's not there. So for me, it's just like it's a lot of work that I feel like it needs to be done, and I'm slowly finding myself being like that voice, and I didn't want that. It's a scary place, a lot to carry, right? But it's like, when I come to places like this and see everybody like willing to listen and willing to like make change, it makes it better.
Thank you, Renata. Jemisha, we are so excited to have you here from the Audre Lorde Project and from the SOS Collective. And we would just love to hear you talk about the context for why is it important from your perspective to do the work around building alternatives to violence, and what are the types of police responses that you all are navigating or dealing with?
Hi, I'm Jemisha from the Safe Outside the System Collective. We're a collective of queer and trans people of color who live in Brooklyn, and we're devoted to building safety strategies that are community-led and don't rely on state systems, because we know where that lands us. We just heard it from everybody on this panel, what happens when the police show up. And so, yeah, sorry, I don't like public speaking.
You're doing great.
Yeah, so we're a collective, and we do a lot of different things, but we have our Safe Neighborhood campaign that we'll probably talk more about later, but it's a campaign that relies on a community. It's kind of a non-traditional campaign, because a lot of times people want the states to make changes, but we don't expect anything from the state, because we know who police officers work for. They don't work for us. They take our tax dollars, but they serve the laws that none of us wrote. And so some of the things that I've seen while being a part of the collective when it comes to police responses to violence has been people reaching out to us. Maybe it was back in January, a gay Black man reached out to us because it was post-Trump, of course. A lot of white people feel emboldened to do ridiculous shit. And so he was leaving out of a community space that a lot of us go to, and he was walking home when a group of white men attacked him. They called him racial slurs, homophobic slurs, and his first response was to call the police. And so at the station, like he was like questioned a lot, and they said that they would try to do things, but like nothing ever came from it. And so at some point we ended up going around and looking at the cameras for him, like as a collective. And a lot of people were like, wow, like we wish you would have known, because like the police officers never came to check the cameras. And so it was at the point where so much time had passed and the police officers didn't check that like the footage wasn't there anymore. But a lot of people were like, wow, they were just here the other day because like a white woman was like attacked. And so they checked the cameras then. So when it comes to like police responses to violence, it's all about who they feel is deserving of violence or like deserving of being protected. And we know that that isn't like queer and trans people of color. And I also want us to acknowledge just like the intersectionality of like the different violences that queer and trans people of color face. Like I'm a Black woman and I'm also queer. But my first experiences with police violence were definitely like through my family. And again, like Renata, like I didn't know, I like trusted that like police officers would do the right thing because that's what they grew up teaching us. But one time I was on my way I had just got accepted into college and my mother was driving me there. And it was like the dead of the night because she likes to do everything early. So we woke up at the crack of dawn. I'm not a morning person. And we're driving, and a police officer pulls us over, and we're like confused because we're like, okay, like we're just like driving, like it's late at night, but we were like in Massachusetts, like some really random, no, it was Connecticut, some really like white part of town we had never been in. And I remember him like running up to the window, like get out of the car, like a gun like pulled out on my mother, and I'm just watching like, like how is this gonna end, you know? And at that point I was like, well, we must have done something wrong. And so from that point on, like my mother, whenever like police officers like come, like she's like terrified. And I know that trauma is like hers and also like trauma from like generations before. Really heavy. Like literally every single person in my family and my immediate family has had like some type of police interaction. I have younger siblings who are now 15, and my little sister, when she was 13, they had called the police because they had reported that like kids were playing in the golf course. We live in the projects, of course, and so somehow Trump decided to build a golf course right across the street because it has a nice view. Yeah. It has a nice view, so they're probably gonna try and kick everyone out soon. But anyway, they had got that report, and so my mother had to go and get my sister from the precinct, and they had her handcuffed. Mind you, she was just in the park playing. Like, they handcuffed a 13-year-old girl. And right now, they're 15 now. My 15-year-old brother is waiting for his court case, where he might end up in juvie. I have a 21-year-old brother who just got sentenced for 4 years for carrying a weapon. And then I have an older brother who has like a really long sentence, and those are all of my siblings. Or actually I have an older sister who called the police once on her. At the time, he was her husband, a white man, and when the police showed up, they arrested her. And they tried to convince him to press charges on her. And so those are my like personal experiences with the police, and I have my own, like being like harassed by like cis Black men in public, and like having them turn the other cheek, or like being with a partner. There was this one time in Harlem, like this man was screaming at us, and we're just like, okay. And police officers just standing there like turning, you know, like they respond to what they want to respond to. And so, yeah, we don't trust the police because there's so much trauma there. And that's just like from my family life. Like I have stories from like my friends and like my comrades who have like these similar stories, like Renata, and even like DV situations that you mentioned. And so with our collective work, we are trying to build up a structure for us to create strategies that are like by queer and trans people of color and like also for us, because right now we have these laws that don't protect us, and we have like these police officers who like they don't care about us, and that's why they're able to like harass us in the street, because they don't think that we're deserving of respect. And so it's all about who they decide to protect, and that's never us. So right now we're working on our Safe Neighborhood campaign, which is like the second reiteration of it, and we train safe spaces in a neighborhood, and that can be cultural workers, individuals, households, orgs, individuals, people who are down for queer and trans people of color, like being safe in a neighborhood and trying to build a network of spaces to hold that work.
Thank you, Jemisha. Before saying anything else, I also have to thank Andrea for writing Invisible No More and for curating this space, Barnard, because I don't know the last time I was on a panel with all black women. And
Give it up for the black women.
so usually when and there's a lot of black women doing work on violence for us and for everybody else. And so usually I have to ask the question about how do we keep everyone safer, and I'm not gonna do that because we get to center ourselves today. So what I'm really curious about are recognizing everything that you've all talked about and all the ways that police responses to violence are creating more violence. What are the safety strategies that you are working on, that you have seen, that you believe in, that keep you safe? And that, keep all of us safe. But really, we can just talk about black women right now.
It's a question for everybody.
It's everybody.
Well, to be very frank and honest, I don't actually believe in the concept of safety. I don't. So it's hard for me, right? I don't think it's possible in a white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, and transphobic society to live safely. So I think we definitely have to uproot all those things for that to be possible for us. I guess in the interim, there's a lot of harm reduction that I do in order to keep myself as intact as possible. That, however, doesn't necessarily mean bad things won't happen to me.
Yeah.
And so it's been a real struggle. Particularly, I spent many, many years working with young black women, black and brown women in Rogers Park in Chicago, as a group of young women called the Rogers Park Young Women's Action Team, that I spent almost 10 years with, from the time they were mostly in their mid-teens until they were about in their mid-20s. And part of the work that they were doing was to try to address street harassment in the community, initially from a perspective from all of them of getting the police to intervene, to try to address this issue, particularly because they were being harassed on their way to school at 7 a.m. by grown men in the community, and they were being harassed on their way home to the point where they were asking male friends and partners to walk them on these major thoroughfares in the community, right? I didn't know this in the same way because as a grown woman, I was driving everywhere, whereas they were walking and taking public transit. I was in a different age bracket, though when I was their age, I was in street harassment hell here in New York, So I understood that, but I had a different social location than them, so I didn't see that as being the primary issue. When we had this anti-violence meeting in our community after there'd been a series of shootings, and we brought these young folks together, and we were like, what is the issue that's the most pressing issue? And for the young men, they were all like gangs, and for the girls, it was all street harassment. And there were like 50 girls, young women there, between the ages of I would say 14 to 18. Everyone was like street harassment. And I was like, oh my God, that's the thing? I was prepared to come in and be like, we're gonna do some stuff on DV, or I was like teen dating violence. I was ready for it, and it was street harassment. So that's kind of the work we ended up doing. But I wanted to bring this up because what ended up happening was their demands were that the police increase patrols between 3 to 6 p.m. so that when they were going to school, coming back home from school, they would have protection. Now you can imagine, for me, as an abolitionist, what it sounded like to me to say, like, get more police down the streets on these 2 streets so that we can walk home safely. And this was a lesson to me, a real lesson about like how working with people who are directly impacted by something, you don't have to like tell them what to do or like what to feel or what to demand. They will demand what they think they need until they figure out that what they need isn't going to give them what they want. Right? And we saw this with these young women where it was like, get the cops on, and by like 3 months in, it was like, get the cops out of the community. They were just like, no, this is not it. I mean, they turned into abolitionists themselves over just seeing what was going on in the neighborhood, in the community. And that led to having to think about, like, what would a restorative community look like then? What would a restorative, how do we do community accountability around addressing street harassment? How do we insist that, yes, those young men who you're asking to walk you home because they're allies to you in that setting, why are they doing street harassment of other people who are, quote, not their friends, but they want to just get with? Like, so can you intervene with them? And that led to the Engaging Young Men as Allies campaign, right? Like, so they started thinking through the ways in which their space could be safer for them, using community members as the folks who would hold other people accountable for this kind of behavior. Last thing, so one of the things they did was they wanted street lights on 2 main thoroughfares to change, so that they felt, quote, safer in the community at night, because these streets were major streets, but they were dark all the time. It took them 5 years, they won the street lights, right? But in the interim, the elected officials invited them all the time, and they were on TV. You know, people were like, oh, these little cute girls asking for this stuff. Anyway, one of the things that the elected officials wanted in the community were cameras. More cameras. By the L, these flashing light cameras, right, that were just mass surveillance for the community. So they bring the young women go in to make their case about these street lights, to make their case for other community, like jobs for young people, so they're not hanging out in front of the stores. Like, they're asking for some concrete demands. The elected officials are like, what do y'all think about street cameras? And the girl's like, no, we're not down for that, we don't want that. What did they do? They went and got those cameras and said the girls wanted it for their safety. Right? Now, what do you think happened as a result of that? When word got out that this group of young black and brown girls who were teenagers were the ones who were proponents for putting up these safety cameras in the neighborhood, what do you think happened? They became targets in the community, so their office doors graffitied and windows broken. When they went to the store, because they lived in the same community, people were like, are you those girls who are asking for that? Those cameras? The people who were dealing were not happy in the community to be further criminalized, number one, but number two, that these were the people who brought it on who were like their sisters, right? So the ways in which the co-option of the state for their own purposes, when you're asking for your safety, play themselves out in these insidious ways are things that you see firsthand. They saw firsthand the way that, quote, collaboration and cooperation with the state gets you fucked up.
That's right.
And that gets turned on you in real negative ways. So I learned a lot from organizing with those young girls for that long about our demands and how they get co-opted and transformed against us, about what they choose to offer you when what you're asking for is something totally different, about the need for us to do that community accountability work ourselves and not be working, waiting for the cops to show up to save us. That's not gonna happen. Like, all those things were taught through a campaign. So I just wanna end by saying that, Dr. Angela Davis points out this all the time, that there are knowledges that are created only through organizing. That is the only way you'll understand certain things. And it could not be more true. That it's through organizing that you could understand it. Like, there's no book I could have read in advance that would have prepared us for what the hell happened. And there's no way that we could have gained the knowledge that we gained in terms of keeping each other as safe as we possibly could by creating a phone tree. You know, that was one of the things that we had as a group, was like, when something happens, here are the people we can call. If you don't call this person, then you call this person, then you call it, like, you know, to get assistance and help. Like, to do those things had to have been learned and won through political organizing. Right? And through the ability for us to actually figure out what kept us safe together. So, I mean, that's a long way of answering your question, but I think it's instructive and important when we're talking about putting community accountability in practice to think about all of the kind of the ways and the forces and everything that are work. You're not doing it in a vacuum, right? There are all these other social forces at work as you're trying to do your thing in your little neighborhood, in your community. You're not doing it outside of those things. You have to navigate those forces while you're actually doing that work. So I'm using YWAD as an example. You can go and find their work, by the way. They sunsetted in 2011, and all their work is archived at rogersywad.org. So you can find a lot of their studies and research and videos and stuff they created over that period of time for your own use, especially if you're working with young women of color in your particular community. There's a whole archive there of work these girls produced that was both research and also practice. So.
So I kind of already mentioned our Safe Neighborhood campaign. This is like the second time that we're doing this campaign. The first time we really focused on businesses because we were like, oh, like, harassment happens like in businesses, it happens in the street. Like if business owners are willing to like step out and intervene, then like that would be like amazing. Or just like creating like these safe spaces for queer and trans people to be in. And so one of the lessons that we learned was that gentrification is horrible. And so most of those businesses closed down. So right now we have like one physical safe space left. Like a lot of people vend now. And so we had to change the way that we're like doing our work. So we did it to include households and just individuals, like people who want to be trained in like de-escalation and bystander intervention to just like step in when they see things happening. Cultural workers, so like people who, cultural worker can be anything, I'm learning that. But yeah, people who like make medicine or have like ancestral practices that are like dying out that are still like necessary for safety. And we still have like some businesses. So right now we're like trying to like rebuild this network with a different framework. And yeah, it's actually like a little hard. Like outreach is a little hard, but it's moving. Right now back in May, we trained 45 individuals in like households before Bedside Pride, which is like this amazing event, which is like all about like safety and like building community. We trained 35 vendors. But now it's like trying to like get things in place so that like we can have those like real strong relationships with each other so that like if something does happen, like we know that you can call those people. Within our collective right now, like we have that kind of trust with each other. So when something does happen, like I know who like I can call. Like you were mentioning like a phone tree. Like we have those systems set up for ourselves, but we really want it within our neighborhood so that like other people who are experiencing violence, like they feel like they have people to like count on. And also, like this is ancestral work. Like we've never been able to like call the police and like actually trust them, like just thinking about the legacy of like police work and the fact that they formed to be able to like return like black people because we were property to return us to like white masters. And so thinking about that legacy and knowing that like, thinking about that legacy and knowing that like they have never been here for our safety, we're also moving into like the second year of our campaign work where we're studying together and trying to figure out what we actually want this to look like the second time around. So we have like different curriculum on like how to train households, how to train businesses, but we want to like develop that with the people who join our campaign work so that, yeah, it's just stronger.
Thanks, Jemisha. It looks like.
I also just want to give a shout out to Ejeris, who's an architect and founder of the Safe Outside the System Collective with the Audre Lorde Project. Thanks, Ejeris. And to also say that across the country, there's been multiple models, if you will, like Safe Outside the System Collective, but we're not necessarily above ground. I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and Durham, North Carolina for over 17 years, and we also were holding different kinds of community-led safety strategies. We just didn't necessarily put it inside of an organization, but especially for queer and trans people of color in the South organizing, it became critical to intervene on state violence and figure out community-led ways to do that. And I also just want to toss into the mix, in terms of safety strategies, there's a tremendous breadth of knowledge, and I call this memory work, of many healers that are stepping into roles of leadership around political liberation, that are politicizing their role as healers, to think about ways that we respond to trauma outside of depending on state models. But with that, we are also, or I should say I and many folks, are also committed to working with healthcare practitioners, social workers, bioethicists, researchers, to actually think about their work, their body of work, and how it's both been complicit with state policing, but also how can it be recreated through a community accountability survivor-led model? Like, what if we think about scientific research done through survivor-led processes? You know, for example, like many of us are survivors of being policed by the state by getting Depo-Provera, whether consensual or non-consensual, but being lied to about what that birth control does or doesn't do to your body, including trans people, in particular, trans women, men transitioning into being, cis women transitioning into being trans men. So like, and being told you have to take Depo because you need that boost of hormones. Like, there are lies being told to us about why we have to take certain medicines inside of the medical industrial complex, and it's part of a state policing ideology of who both for profit, but also a mythology of whose body which we're living in. And then just to think about how are we thinking of the ways that physicians and nurses and practitioners are actually being asked about their own safety planning and strategies. So a nurse just got arrested for not letting the police, right? Folks know about this story. Which state was it in? The state just left my mind. Utah, right? So who was arrested, right, for basically protecting the dignity and well-being of their patient. And I think that there'll be more increased liability for nurses and doctors who take this role, but then what does that mean for the transformation of looking at safety inside of hospitals and clinics? How do we actually have the debate on how do they also ensure their own safety in trying to be allies?
Thank you. So we now want to move to be in dialogue with you all, recognizing that many of you are also a part of movements to address violence, movements to address violence outside of kind of state systems. So if people have questions, if people want to raise up strategies that they're working on, we want to hear it.
Thank you. I don't have a strategy just yet, but I'm working on it. Okay?
Awesome.
A couple of things. Once again, I work as I'm a certified nurse midwife, and I work as a director of midwifery and maternal child health at a hospital in Brooklyn. And I'm getting my doctorate, and that's why I'm here. And I'm learning so much. So this has just been mind-blowing. A couple of things, though, in terms of defining safety. It's not defined by us, okay? Safety is defined by people who don't look like us. And the police is there to keep them safe and to keep us under control. So that's why coming up with a definition of safety is just very challenging, especially for me. Cara, you took me to church, okay? I want to thank you for bringing up our stolen history in healthcare. It's part of some research that I did when I was in midwifery school, looking at the role of midwives during slavery. And one of the things that I read about, or one of the monsters that I read about, was J. Marion Sims. So I would like to challenge everybody in the audience to petition our city to get rid of his statue outside of Central Park. Okay? Thank you. Miss Renata, I just wanted to talk to you, about women who are assaulted and killed by these men with these fragile egos. I can relate to your story because I've been harassed in the street as well, and was practically the verbal abuse that I received just because I didn't pay attention, or I just said no thank you, or I smiled and kept walking, was ridiculous. And I remember as a teenager being followed down the street by a man who just continually cursed me out for a city block. But now women are being killed just for saying no, and that needs to be examined. And also, Jemisha, in terms of police responding differently to different people, I live in Bedford-Stuyvesant, in the very gentrified part of Bedford-Stuyvesant, and I had a woman who happened to be white break into my home. She was in the hall, and she was very high. And when the police responded to my call for help because she was trying to get into my apartment, they asked her if she was okay. And I flipped. I really flipped. So I'm screaming at the cops, you should be asking me if I'm okay. I'm the one who called you, and this, that, and the other. They thought it was so funny. She had urinated in the hall and just made a mess of herself. So I was up at 4 o'clock in the morning mopping the floors. But that's besides the point. They were responding to her and her needs and never came and asked me if I was okay. And that was not okay. So thank you all for your panel.
Thank you.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you all. You guys are like bosses, so like motivation and stuff. But I had a question. So like obviously there's a separation between like the Black community and like sort of a productive government policy that can in any way protect us. So I wanted to know if you thought the solution to that would be to sort of integrate Black people in those spaces of enforcement or policy, and if so, like how will we like build a sort of rapport to make sure that that space is effective?
Hello, yes, just thank you to all of you for imparting your wisdom on us today. As a survivor of like intimate partner violence, and that I experienced in college, and the kind of the violence that I experienced, not necessarily at the hands of the police in that instance, but as the institution of the university itself. I wanted to call into attention, like, we are on a university campus, right, and there are police, they have their own separate police systems, a lot of universities do. I went to Duke University, and so they have their own separate Duke police that does its own racist shit, in addition to Durham police. So I was just wondering, when we talk about building community with Black women, with Black trans people, and gender nonconforming people, et cetera, how do we build those community accountability measures so that survivors don't have to reach out to, or if they don't want to, they don't have to reach out to these institutions for help?
Thank you. I'll give folks a chance to respond. So we talked a bit about the definition of safety, some pieces around the medical industrial complex. What do people think of the strategy of integrating a force or integrating as a way to address the kind of police response issues that we're talking about? And also, what does it mean to build community among Black women, trans folks, gender nonconforming folks, and queer folks to address intimate partner violence, particularly within campuses?
So maybe I'll speak to the question around integrating into existing structures to try to change those structures. I guess isn't that the argument or the thought we've been having for how long have Black people been here? And you know what I mean? Like that whether it makes sense, whether like having Black faces in high places actually does anything. And I would say that people will differ on that. Some people think it made a tremendous difference to have a Black president, and other people didn't see the rewards of that, in their lives. I think it's always good to have many different kinds of voices and many different kinds of people at the table. I don't know that that's a guarantee for justice, but I think it's never bad to have lots of different kinds of people weighing into policy. I guess I care more about what people's ideology is than I do like necessarily their experience mainly. Like, I want to know what analysis you're bringing to bear when you're talking about policy, because I know a lot of very conservative, punitive Black people, and I wouldn't want them at the table making decisions around criminal punishment, for example. You know, I wouldn't. I remember when we were fighting in the early 90s against the Bill Clinton's crime bill. And I remember being in a church in Harlem. And because I understand why people felt this way, right? Like, they wanted to be safer in their communities, and they were told that these laws were going to do that for them. And people signed on to 3 strikes, mandatory minimums, all these other things that help to sustain and build on a mass prison nation, thinking that those laws were actually going to do for Black people what Black people thought they were doing, because what people in that church were asking for was not mainly just the laws. They were also saying, we want resources. And what the white politicians and the Black politicians in Washington and in state capitals did was give them all the punishment and none of the resources, which is the way that things work all the time. But I remember sitting in that church and just like listening to how people were talking about other people and just crying the entire time. So I think it matters to a degree, but I think we have to be real about like what we want is people with an analysis that is actually transformative, possibility for transformation. That matters more, at least to me. But I think other people have other thoughts about that.
I want to speak to the campus security, everything you said, riffing off of you, Mariame. Just that I want to go back to the harm reduction space that you created, is that I think there is a presumption in Black movement space, I'm presuming right now, that we all have the same idea of safety. And that, going back to ideologies, that we can't have differing ideologies of what safety means. So, or that's actually seen as violent. And I'm very concerned that ideological difference has become violent. I'm very confused by it. I'm distressed. Let's have longer conversations. But how do we, in looking at reducing harm, or even understanding that we are, most of us, all of us, survivors of sexual violence, oppressive systems of violence, and we can do harm to each other. I'm a survivor of family violence. Multiple members of my family have done harm to me, and I made a conscious choice not to call the police and put them in prison for the physical violence they caused to me and others that I love, because I love them too. It's complicated, right? So I think what I offer to the conversation, a question to the question is, what can we imagine to create with each other that doesn't presume I can be healed by you or I can heal you? Or you can fix it or I can fix it. Because colonization is big and I can't fucking fix it. So what are we going to create together? And that it's ongoing and it changes, and not presume to know what safety is for all of us. There's not one way to do it. There's not one way to heal. There's presumptions being made about what is healing. What does it mean to be healed? I'm concerned. And that and then it becomes violent if you say, actually, I'm not going to be healed that way. And I was like, and that's violent? I was like, wait, Christian supremacy said it would heal all of us too. So, you know what I mean? And that was violence. So just some questions about ideological difference and expanding our ideas and allowing it to be consensual.
I think I'll speak into like, as far as like integrating into these certain spaces, right? I think that it's important that even when doing so, you know, it's not making much of a difference. Well, not fast enough. You know, I just attended a workshop with AmeriCorps where all the chapters in New Jersey was in a conference similar to this, and they was going to break up into 2 workshops, and one was restorative justice and the other was shelter management. So I'm like, okay, I got my notepad, I'm hyped. I'm about to get this information, you know, because I love working with reentry, right, in the nonprofit world, because I feel like a lot of the nonprofits are bullshit, and I like to go in there and like shake shit up and make them live up to what they say, you know, the services they say they're going to provide. So I'm usually working by myself, and all nonprofits, they hate me. Except for my clients, but that's when you know you're doing something right, right? So I'm at this workshop, and the guy, once I realized who's moderating it, I'm like, this is about to blow mine, because I attended one of his workshops before, and to give you a little history, he's an ex-officer, retired officer, right? Of color, right? And the first workshop that I attended of his, he passed out a questionnaire. He was supposed to be helping us learn how to survive and to save our life when we're approached by the officers, right, by the law. And I'm like, this is interesting, right? So I'm like, yeah, I'm ready for this workshop. I filled it out. I was like, I got all the right answers. I've been down this road, right? So one of the questions, I'll give you an example, is when you're stopped by the police and you know they have no probable cause to stop you or let alone search your vehicle, but the officer come up and say, let me see your license, registration, and may I search your car? Do you say A, no, B, yes, or C, none of the above? Something stupid like that, right? Oh, it's A. You say no. No probable cause? What? No. So when they went up there, usually I'm the spokesperson for my group, and I'm like, I ain't going up there. Something telling me in my gut to sit back here and watch, right? And good thing I didn't, because they probably would have escorted me out, because every question that I answered was completely wrong. And I was utterly disgusted to my stomach. Like, I turned to my director. I said, yo, I'm out. I'm leaving. I said, because if not, I'm going on that stage. And I knew it wasn't the right time at that moment, but I was like, yo, it pissed me off that I didn't go on the stage. It pissed me off later on that I didn't speak up when I know that I should have, right? But everything happens for a reason. Now, the second workshop that I just went to at the end of October, and I see it's this guy again. This should be interesting. So he starts off, anybody in the room ever been, convicted of a crime or in trouble with the law? About 2 people raised their hands. I'm usually like, oh yeah, let me tell you what happened to me. But something was like, Renata, low key, just follow the conversation, right? And I did. I followed the conversation in restorative justice. And he started off with showing a video, okay, of a woman, a white woman, a black kid running up behind her, snatching her purse and running. She falls to the ground. She looks up. They give eye contact. He looks back. First of all, it's bad acting. He ain't looking back. He gonna keep going, right? He got the bag. He out, right? So he looks back. They give eye contact. It was a real intimate moment with, I guess, your abuser or your attacker, right? So then they kept showing the same woman in different, places, getting attacked, falling to the ground, and seeing this guy. Now, it wasn't happening anymore, but in her mind, that trauma replayed over and over again, right? So I'm like, all right, what is he trying to say? Like, I don't get it, right? And then another video was of a woman who, said that this kid broke into her house, robbed her house. She wasn't home. But now, restorative justice to this retired officer looked like this. In the video, the victim gets to sit down at a table with the offender and approach the offender, right? And they get to come to some type of agreement, or they get to express how that crime made them feel, and the offender get to express that he apologized or she apologized, right? So I'm just like, oh, wow. And I'm like, maybe that could work a little bit, I believe the victims need some type of closure. But then it comes to a point where the lady said, well, yeah, you could pay off your restoration fees, or maybe you could come back to the house and, work some of the... That ain't right. We know that ain't happening. We know that not happening. So, right, everybody's talking. Now they're into a conversation. And I'll wrap this up. They're into a conversation, right? And the victim and the offender. These 2 terms are going around the room. People are talking. And there's a lot of young kids that's in college, and they following this guy's lead, right? And one of the questions is it important to try to understand why the offender committed the crime? Half the room was about 80 people. Half the room said no. They don't give a shit. The other half said yeah, right? So I'm just sitting there. I'm like, yo, I got to go. So my friend said, don't leave. So I said, if not, I'm going off in here. She was like, well, you need to go off. You walked out on the last one. You need to check him. And I was like, man, I'm going to lose my contract. I'm finishing December. He going to cut my contract, right? But I'm like, you know what? Somebody else will pay for me to go to school. I got to say what I got to say. So as it came to an end, I said to him, I raised my hand, and I said, Eldridge, put his name out there, look him up anyway. I said, Eldridge, I said, I'm trying really hard to follow this conversation, and this little dialogue you got going on. You know how we always be like, you know, this little dialogue, right? I said, but it's really difficult. He said, well, you know, tell me why. I could explain it. I said, I doubt you'll be able to, but I'm going to explain to you why anyway. I said, you know, we're sitting here talking about the victim and the offender. First of all, restorative justice, no disrespect to those that are victims, has nothing to do with the victim. It doesn't have anything to do with the victim. Now, do they need closure and that treatment to be able to heal? Of course, and I'm all for it. But restorative justice is not focused on the victim and the offender. I said, and who the hell is defining who's a victim and who's an offender? I said, I want to know how we're using that term. I said, because, you know, these people are following your lead and what you're saying. And I said, based off of how y'all throwing that word around, I'm an offender. But I'm proud as hell to have offended. Because if not, I started off being a victim. You know, I said, so I saved my own life. And, you know, this was the first time ever this guy was completely speechless. And I was mad because I wanted to hear his feedback. Like, I wanted to understand. I wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt that he just got it fucked up. And he want to apologize and didn't think that deep far into what restorative justice is. So he took the mic from me. After me saying a couple of more things, he took the mic. But the head of AmeriCorps was like, we want you to come up to D.C., you know, and work with us on different policies that's dealing with reentry and restorative justice. And I'm like, yeah, because we need to get this shit done. And we need to do it the right way and starting from the ground up, you know?
Thank you for being here with us as we discuss police responses to violence. And the truth is that we want this dialogue to continue. It's not just about like kind of a question and answer and panel to y'all, but how we be in community for the rest of this conference. So thank you for—
Wait 1 second, Ejeris. If I can just quickly give you 2 resources so that you can follow up on some stuff. A lot of conversation that Cara shared about kind of institutional violence and the collusion between, you know, social services and the law enforcement. Project NIA, my organization, just put out a new toolkit that's called Whose Security Is It? That you can use in your hospitals, in your social work programs, and whatever, to teach people about institutional violence and what to do in terms of harm reduction in working with security and police. You can find that at the picis.org. You should check out the Creative Interventions Toolkit, put out by Creative Interventions for people who want to do community accountability work as it relates to domestic violence and sexual violence. And finally, there's a table out there where I'm inviting people to write holiday cards to incarcerated survivors. So if you get a chance during the time you're here today to stop by and do that, we at Survived and Punished would be very grateful. Thank you.
Just to invite folks who are studying to be counselors or therapists, there's a new network called the National Queer and Trans Therapists of Color Network, really trying to reimagine ways that we're holding healing and wellness for the mental well-being of our people. And I am here as an activist in residence working on a timeline on the medical industrial complex, policing and surveillance, and we'll be doing some trainings and classes off of that with a community of healers, health practitioners, and scientists across the country. If you're interested, let me know.